Judge Williams was accustomed to difficult cases, but this one was different. When two black twin girls, orphaned and alone, were brought into the courtroom, his heart wavered. Their frightened eyes and tightly clasped hands told a story of pain and loss that he knew all too well. In that moment, he realized his decision would change everything. What do you think about this story? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to find out what happens next. Judge William Williams sat in his chambers, the weight of another long day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The courtroom had emptied hours ago, but the silence only magnified the memories that often lingered after particularly challenging cases. Today's case, one involving systemic neglect in the foster care system, had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to confront for years. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the family photograph on his desk. The photo, taken decades ago, showed a boy of about 9, standing awkwardly beside his mother, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. The boy was himself, though the hopeful glimmer in his eyes had long since been replaced by the hardened resolve of a man who had fought too many battles to count. William's childhood in the Deep South had been marked by humiliation and racism, experiences that had shaped the man he would become. Growing up as one of the few black children in a predominantly white neighborhood, he quickly learned the sting of exclusion. Classmates mocked his skin color, whispered cruel names, and made him feel like an outsider in every room he entered. At school, teachers overlooked his intelligence, dismissing his efforts as though he wasn't worth their time. On the streets, adults gave him looks that ranged from pity to disdain. Even the simplest joys, a trip to the park, a visit to the corner store, were marred by the ever-present reality of his otherness. His mother, a fiercely determined woman who worked multiple jobs to keep them afloat, often told him, "They'll try to break you, but don't let them. You're worth more than their hate." She was his rock, his guiding light, but even her strength couldn't shield him from the pain he endured. One memory, in particular, haunted him even now. He had been 12 years old, walking home from school with a notebook full of scribbled essays about the future he dreamed of, being a lawyer, maybe even a judge. That day, a group of older boys cornered him in an alley. They jeered at his aspirations, tearing the notebook from his hands and scattering its pages in the dirt. One of them spat on the ground near his feet, sneering, "You'll never be anything but what we say you are." He had wanted to fight back, to scream, to prove them wrong in that moment. But instead, he froze, humiliation burning through him as their laughter echoed in his ears. When he finally arrived home, his mother found him sitting on the porch, his face streaked with tears. "What happened, baby?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "They said I'll never be anything," he whispered, his hands clenched into fists. She knelt beside him, cupping his face in her hands. "Don't you ever believe that," she said fiercely. "You're going to show them what you're made of. And one day, they'll see just how wrong they were." That moment became the fuel for everything he did. He threw himself into his studies, determined to rise above the limitations the world had placed on him. He excelled in school, earned a scholarship to a prestigious university, and eventually made his way to law school. Every achievement was a silent victory over the voices that had once tried to break him. But as he ascended the ranks to become one of the few black judges in his circuit, the scars of his past never fully faded. He carried them with him into every courtroom, using them as a reminder of the injustices he had endured, and of the work that still needed to be done. Yet, there were moments, like today, when those scars felt raw again. Cases involving children, especially black children, hit him the hardest. He saw himself in their eyes, their pain mirroring his own. He saw the systems that had failed him as a child, still grinding others under their weight. That evening, Judge Williams sat at his kitchen table, the sound of the clock ticking in the background. He stared at the case file in front of him, unable to shake the image of the two young girls who had been at the center of today's hearing. They reminded him of himself, their eyes reflecting the same mix of fear and defiance he had felt as a child. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to confront the memories he usually buried. The humiliation, the rage, the longing for justice, all of it surged to the surface. But alongside the pain was a quiet determination, a voice that had always guided him forward. Asterisk, you're here for a reason. Don't waste it, asterisk. As the night stretched on, Williams made a decision. He didn't know yet how, but he would find a way to help those girls, just as he had once wished someone would have helped him. He would ensure that their story didn't end the way so many others had, forgotten, dismissed, lost in the cracks of a broken system. Because if his own scars had taught him anything, it was this: even in the face of cruelty, resilience could light the way forward. The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning, the typical rustle of papers and muted conversations replaced by an almost palpable tension. Judge Williams sat at his bench, his gavel resting idly beside him as the next case was announced. His eyes scanned the docket, his mind preparing for another routine hearing. But the moment the doors opened, everything changed. Two young black girls, no older than 7, entered the courtroom. They were identical twins, their resemblance so striking it was almost disorienting. They clung to each other, their small hands tightly entwined, as if letting go might cause them to disappear. Their hair was neatly braided, and their dresses, one lavender, the other pale blue, hung awkwardly on their slight frames, as though borrowed or hastily chosen. Judge Williams felt his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't just their appearance that seized his attention, it was their eyes. Wide, fearful, and glistening with unshed tears, they held a quiet desperation that he recognized all too well. It was the same look he had seen in his own reflection as a boy, standing on the steps of a schoolyard where he never felt welcome. The same look he had carried through years of trying to prove his worth in a world that sought to diminish him. The twins were led to a table by a social worker, her expression one of practiced detachment. She shuffled papers, her demeanor efficient but cold, as if these two children were just another case in an endless stream. The girls didn't speak. They sat close together, their shoulders brushing, their hands never separating. Their silence screamed louder than any words could. "State your case," Judge Williams said, his voice steady, though his chest felt tight. The social worker rose, her tone flat as she detailed the circumstances. The girls' parents had died in a car accident 6 months prior, leaving no immediate family willing to take them in. They had been shuffled between temporary foster homes, none of which had worked out. Now, the system was seeking a more permanent placement. As the social worker spoke, Judge Williams couldn't take his eyes off the twins. He noticed the way they glanced around the room, their gazes darting toward the exits as if searching for an escape. He saw the way they leaned into each other, a silent promise of protection in a world that had already taken too much from them. When the social worker finished, there was a beat of silence before Judge Williams spoke. "Have there been any relatives who've expressed interest in taking them?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "No, Your Honor," the social worker replied. "The family connections we've contacted have declined to take on the responsibility." Responsibility. The word hung in the air like a condemnation. Judge Williams shifted in his seat, his fingers brushing the edge of his gavel. He felt a flicker of anger, not at the social worker, who was simply doing her job, but at the system that had failed these girls long before they entered his courtroom. The lawyer representing the state began speaking, outlining the next steps in the process, but Judge Williams barely heard him. His focus remained on the twins. One of them, the girl in lavender, was nervously twisting the hem of her dress, her lips pressed together in a tight line. The other, in pale blue, had her head bowed, her shoulders trembling slightly. It wasn't until a single tear slipped down her cheek that he realized she was crying. The sight struck him like a blow. He thought of his own mother, the way she had wiped his tears when he was a boy, whispering words of comfort that felt too fragile to hold back the weight of the world. He thought of the kids in his neighborhood who hadn't had anyone to wipe their tears, who had been swallowed by a system that saw them as numbers rather than people. Judge Williams cleared his throat, the sound startling in the stillness of the room. "What do the girls want?" he asked, his voice softer now. The question seemed to catch everyone off guard. The lawyer hesitated, glancing at the social worker, who looked equally uncertain. "Your Honor, their children," the lawyer began, his tone almost dismissive. "Their preferences." "I asked what they want," Judge Williams interrupted, his gaze sharp as it pinned the lawyer in place. The twins looked up, their eyes wide with surprise. For the first time, they seemed to realize that someone in the room was paying attention to them, not as a case file or a problem to be solved, but as two frightened children who had lost everything. The girl in lavender was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "We just want to stay together," she said, her words trembling but clear. Her sister nodded, her hand tightening around her twins. "Please," she added, her voice cracking. "Don't take her away from me." The simplicity of their plea cut through the procedural veneer of the courtroom. Judge Williams felt a lump rise in his throat, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and sorrow. How many times had children like these been forced to beg for scraps of stability, for the basic dignity of staying with the only family they had left? He leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but gentle. "No one is going to separate you," he said, his words carrying a weight he hoped they would believe. "Not while I'm here." The girls exchanged a glance, their expressions shifting from fear to something softer, hope, tentative but present. Judge Williams felt his resolve harden. He didn't know yet how, but he would make sure these girls had more than just the promise of staying together. They deserved more. They deserved a chance at a life where they wouldn't have to plead for their humanity. For the first time in years, Judge Williams felt the fire of a forgotten duty reignite within him. This case wasn't just about the law, it was about justice. And justice, he realized, was exactly what these girls deserved. The story of the two twin sisters was one of heartbreak and resilience, though the weight of their young lives already seemed unbearable. Their journey to the courtroom was not a straight path, but one riddled with loss, neglect, and the cruel indifference of a world that seemed determined to strip them of their innocence. It began on a rainy night 6 months ago. The girls' parents had been returning home from a late shift at the factory where their mother worked. Exhausted but eager to see their daughters, they had hurried through the stormy streets. The accident was sudden, a slick patch of road, a skidding truck, and then the silence that follows tragedy. The girls, waiting at home with a babysitter, didn't know their lives were about to change forever. When the police arrived at the door, their small world collapsed. The twins clung to each other as the news was delivered in halting, sympathetic tones. Their parents weren't coming back. The babysitter, pale and overwhelmed, called child services, and by the end of the night, the sisters were swept into the care of strangers. The first foster home wasn't the worst, but it wasn't much of a home either. Their foster parents were kind on the surface but distant, treating the girls as though they were an inconvenience. The house was clean, meals were provided, but there was no warmth, no sense of belonging. The twins, already fragile from their loss, found solace only in each other. They whispered stories about their parents at night, holding on to fading memories of their mother's laughter and their father's steady voice. But even their shared bond wasn't enough to shield them from the growing sense of abandonment that crept in during the quiet moments. When the first foster placement ended abruptly over what they later learned was a payment dispute, the girls were moved again. This time, the house was smaller, the rules stricter, and the care colder. They were given mismatched clothes and told to keep their belongings in plastic bags, as if permanence was a luxury they didn't deserve. School became another battleground. The girls, now thrust into a predominantly white school district, quickly became targets of cruel taunts and whispers. Classmates mocked their skin color, their hair, and their clothes. Teachers, often well-meaning but woefully unaware, overlooked their struggles, treating their silence as apathy rather than pain. One particularly cruel incident left the twins shaken for weeks. During lunch, a group of boys had cornered them, laughing as they smeared ketchup on their hair, calling it dirty. The cafeteria monitors didn't intervene, and the girls were left to clean themselves up in the bathroom, tears streaming down their faces as they tried to scrub away the humiliation. The girl in lavender, Amara, the more outspoken of the two, tried to fight back. She stood up to her tormentors once, only to be punished herself for causing disruption. Her sister, Aaliyah, quieter and more reserved, withdrew even further, finding solace only in the presence of her twin. Without their parents, the world felt cold and unforgiving. At night, in their shared bed, they often whispered questions they couldn't answer. Why did this happen to us? What did we do wrong? Their foster parents never provided comfort, and the system seemed to treat them as just another set of names on a long list. The weight of their grief was compounded by the constant instability. Each new home meant new rules, new faces, and new fears. The sisters clung to each other with a desperation that only deepened as the months dragged on. They learned to rely on themselves, building a small world of whispered dreams and secret hand squeezes that only they understood. By the time they arrived in Judge Williams's courtroom, they were exhausted. The social worker who brought them in had assured them this was just a formality, but the girls had heard that before. Every move, every new home, had been accompanied by similar promises, none of which had ever led to the stability they so desperately craved. They sat in the courtroom, their hands tightly clasped, trying to shrink into the smallest versions of themselves. Amara's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, while Aaliyah kept her gaze fixed on the floor, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. They had no hope left to give, only the raw instinct to survive another day. What they didn't know, as they sat there in silence, was that this courtroom would become the turning point in their lives. For the first time, someone would see them, not as a case file or a burden, but as two children who had endured far more than anyone their age should have to bear. Judge Williams didn't just see their fear, he saw their resilience. And in their eyes, he found the spark that would reignite his own purpose. Their story, marked by loss and pain, wasn't over. It was about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The courtroom was heavy with tension as the trial progressed, the sterile language of legal arguments doing little to mask the grim reality behind the case. Judge Williams sat at his bench, his sharp gaze fixed on the endless parade of documents and testimonies presented before him. Each new piece of evidence peeled back another layer of the system that had failed these girls so profoundly. And with each revelation, his anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. The foster care system was supposed to be a refuge for children like Amara and Aaliyah, a safety net in the aftermath of tragedy. But as the details of their journey unfolded, it became clear that the system was anything but. The girls had been shuffled between homes with little regard for their emotional well-being, treated as commodities rather than children in need of care. Each move, each new placement, had stripped away another layer of their innocence, leaving them fragile and distrustful. The social worker's testimony painted a bleak picture. Overworked and underfunded, the agency responsible for the girls had made decisions based on convenience rather than compassion. Their first placement had been chosen not for compatibility, but because it was the closest available home. When that family decided they weren't a good fit, the girls were uprooted again, their lives packed into black garbage bags as if they were disposable. The more Judge Williams listened, the more he saw the insidious patterns beneath the surface. The foster care system, riddled with bureaucratic inefficiency, had failed these girls at every turn. But it wasn't just incompetence, it was a deeper, systemic indifference rooted in prejudice. Statistics were presented as part of the case. Black children, despite making up a smaller percentage of the population, were disproportionately represented in foster care. They were less likely to be placed in permanent homes and more likely to age out of the system without any form of stability. Amara and Aaliyah were just two of countless children lost in a system designed to fail them. Judge Williams felt a familiar ache in his chest as he absorbed the data. It wasn't just numbers, it was lived experience. He remembered the kids he had grown up with, those who hadn't been lucky enough to escape the cycle. The boy who disappeared one day, swallowed by a system no one questioned. The girl who stopped coming to school, her absence explained away by whispers of foster care. Those children were now statistics, their stories erased by indifference. The testimony of a former foster parent was particularly damning. The man, called to the stand to explain why he had returned the girls to the agency, spoke with a dispassionate tone that sent a chill through the room. They were too much to handle, he said, shrugging as though discussing a returned product. Always crying, always clinging to each other. I couldn't separate them, they'd throw tantrums. Judge Williams's grip tightened on his gavel. The man's words were a reminder of how these girls had been treated, not as children deserving of love, but as problems to be managed. The girls' school records told a similar story. Amara had been labeled disruptive, a catch-all term used to dismiss her attempts to stand up for herself. Aaliyah's teachers described her as withdrawn and unmotivated, never questioning the trauma that had silenced her voice. The system had failed to see them as individuals, instead branding them with labels that perpetuated their struggles. As the trial continued, it became impossible to ignore the role of race in the girls' experiences. Judge Williams listened as expert witnesses explained how black children in foster care were often placed in environments that ignored or invalidated their cultural identity. Foster parents were rarely provided with the tools or training to support black children, leaving them isolated and alienated in homes where they didn't feel they belonged. For Amara and Aaliyah, this had meant enduring countless microaggressions, from foster siblings mocking their hair to adults dismissing their complaints as overreacting. It was a constant erosion of their sense of self, a slow, silent cruelty that left scars invisible to the untrained eye. Judge Williams felt his anger grow with each passing moment. He knew the statistics, but seeing their effects up close, in the faces of these two frightened girls, made the injustice all the more visceral. The system wasn't just broken, it was complicit in perpetuating the very inequalities it claimed to address. By the time the trial concluded for the day, Judge Williams was left with a heavy heart and a sharper sense of purpose. The girl's story wasn't unique, it was a symptom of a larger, systemic failure that demanded more than legal remedies. It demanded accountability, reform, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths about how society treated its most vulnerable members. As he sat in his chambers that evening, the weight of the case pressed heavily on his mind. He thought of Amara and Aaliyah, their small hands clasped tightly together as they navigated a world that had failed them at every turn. And he thought of his own past, the systems that had tried to break him and the resilience it had taken to rise above them. This case was about more than justice for two girls, it was about exposing the cracks in a system that continued to break lives. And Judge Williams knew that he couldn't simply render a verdict and move on. He had a responsibility, not just as a judge, but as a man who understood the pain of being overlooked and underestimated. The system might have failed these girls, but he wouldn't. Not this time. The courtroom was silent, the kind of heavy stillness that follows a moment of profound realization. Judge Williams sat at his bench, the weight of the decision before him pressing heavily on his shoulders. The case had concluded, the legal arguments exhausted, and yet, as the gavel rested within his reach, he hesitated. Not because he doubted the law, but because he doubted the system that wielded it. The twins sat at their table, their small hands intertwined as they waited for his ruling. They didn't understand the intricacies of the law or the nuances of the arguments that had been presented. All they knew was that they were once again at the mercy of strangers, their futures hanging by a thread. Judge Williams leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the girls. Their eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and hope, reminded him of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: responsibility. Not the kind mandated by his title or his role, but a deeper, more personal sense of duty. These children had been let down at every turn, their lives shaped by a system that had failed to see their humanity. He couldn't let that continue. As the court awaited his decision, memories of his own childhood surfaced unbidden. He thought of the loneliness he had felt as a boy, the constant battle to prove his worth in a world that seemed intent on dismissing him. He thought of his mother, who had fought tirelessly to protect him, and of the children he had grown up with who hadn't been as lucky. Amara and Aaliyah had no one left to fight for them. Their parents were gone, their relatives had turned away, and the foster care system had treated them as little more than numbers in a ledger. They needed someone who wouldn't just advocate for them in a courtroom, but who would stand by them every day, through every challenge and every triumph. In that moment, Judge Williams knew what he had to do. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the stillness of the room. This case, he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion, has revealed not just the failure of a system, but the resilience of two remarkable children. He paused, his eyes meeting the twins. Amara, Aaliyah, he said, addressing them directly, you deserve more than what this system has offered you. You deserve stability, love, and a home where you can feel safe. The girls exchanged a glance, confusion flickering across their faces. Judge Williams took a deep breath, knowing the magnitude of what he was about to say. I am ruling in favor of a solution that guarantees your safety and well-being. Effective immediately, I am stepping forward as your guardian. I will adopt you both. The room erupted in whispers and gasps, the shock palpable among the lawyers, the social worker, and even the courtroom staff. The twins stared at him, their mouths slightly open, as though they couldn't quite process his words. You mean we're going with you? Amara finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. Judge Williams nodded, a small, reassuring smile breaking through his usual stern demeanor. Yes. You're coming home with me. The decision sent ripples through the legal community. Colleagues questioned his judgment, accusing him of crossing professional boundaries. Some called it an emotional overreach, while others whispered that he was undermining the objectivity of the bench. The media seized the story, framing it as both an act of heroism and a controversial gamble. Even within his personal circle, the decision was met with resistance. Friends warned him of the challenges ahead. You've never been a parent before, William, one of them said, concern etched across her face. Do you really think you're ready for this? But none of it swayed him. He had spent his entire career navigating the complexities of justice, and this decision, though unconventional, felt truer to his purpose than anything he had done before. Bringing the girls home was both exhilarating and daunting. His once quiet house, filled only with the echoes of his solitary routines, now bustled with life. The twins were cautious at first, their movements tentative as they explored their new environment. They spoke in whispers, their trust in him not yet fully formed. Judge Williams, for all his confidence in the courtroom, found himself navigating uncharted territory. He burned dinner on their first night, eliciting giggles from the girls that melted the tension between them. He fumbled with braiding their hair, eventually turning to online tutorials for help. Each small act of care became a step toward building the family they all desperately needed. The transition wasn't without its challenges. The girls carried the weight of their past, and there were moments when their fear and mistrust resurfaced. But Judge Williams met those moments with patience, his determination unwavering. He learned to listen, to comfort, and, most importantly, to love without reservation. Adopting the girls wasn't just a personal decision, it was a statement. By taking them in, Judge Williams defied a system that had deemed them unworthy of consistent care. He sent a message to the world that these children, and countless others like them, deserved better. His decision also reignited his commitment to reform. In the months that followed, he used his platform to advocate for changes within the foster care system, pushing for policies that prioritize the well-being of children over bureaucratic convenience. He spoke at conferences, met with lawmakers, and became a vocal critic of the racial biases that perpetuated inequality within the system. For Judge Williams, adopting Amara and Aaliyah was more than an act of compassion, it was a turning point. It was a moment that redefined his life, not as a judge, but as a father. Together, they began a new chapter, one built on resilience, love, and the unwavering belief that even in a broken system, there is always room for hope. The morning after Judge Williams's groundbreaking decision, the world seemed eerily quiet, as if the storm brewing outside hadn't yet reached his doorstep. But he knew it was only a matter of time. By mid-morning, the phone calls started, a mix of curious inquiries, cautious congratulations, and thinly veiled criticisms. The news had spread quickly. A sitting judge had adopted 2 black twin girls from the foster system. It was unprecedented, controversial, and to some, unforgivable. The first wave of criticism came from within his own circle. Colleagues who had once respected him now questioned his professionalism. William, one senior judge, said during a private call, her tone heavy with disapproval, "This decision of yours, it's highly unorthodox. Some might say it compromises your objectivity on the bench." He held his composure, responding firmly, "I've always been objective when it comes to the law. But objectivity doesn't mean ignoring humanity. These girls deserve better, and I couldn't stand by and let them fall through the cracks." Her silence was telling. The conversation ended abruptly, but the echoes of her words lingered. Soon, the legal community began murmuring about whether his decision set a dangerous precedent. Anonymous comments in professional forums accused him of emotional bias, while others hinted that he had overstepped the ethical boundaries of his position. The backlash wasn't just professional, it was personal. At home, Judge Williams found that even his neighborhood, once a place of relative peace, became a breeding ground for gossip. Whispers floated through the air during his morning walks, neighbors exchanging glances as he passed by. One evening, as he worked in the front yard, a woman from down the street stopped by. "I heard about what you've done," she said, her tone somewhere between polite and condescending. "It's admirable, really, but don't you think it's complicated? Bringing them here?" "What's complicated," he replied evenly, setting down his rake, "is how we live in a society that lets children suffer while we stand by and watch." Her forced smile faltered, and she quickly excused herself, but the message was clear: not everyone was supportive. The ugliest reactions came in the form of anonymous messages and online posts. Social media buzzed with discussions about his decision, many of them steeped in racial prejudice. Comments ranged from subtle dog whistles to outright vitriol. A judge is supposed to uphold the law, not play savior. Typical bleeding heart liberal. Why does he think those kids belong in our community? One morning, Williams found a letter in his mailbox with no return address. Inside, written in block letters, was a single phrase: "You don't belong here." He folded the paper carefully, his face impassive, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his anger. He had faced racism before, this was far from new. But now, it wasn't just about him. It was about protecting the 2 small lives that had been entrusted to him. Even some of his friends distanced themselves. One longtime acquaintance invited him to lunch, only to spend the meal peppering him with veiled questions. "Don't you think this will affect your career?" she asked, stirring her coffee with unnecessary vigor. I mean, people might see this as emotional overreach. It's not overreach to do what's right, he replied curtly, pushing his plate aside. And if my career suffers because of it, so be it. Her lips tightened, and the conversation drifted into awkward small talk. By the time the check arrived, he knew their friendship would never be the same. Amara and Aaliyah, too, began to feel the weight of society's judgment. At school, their classmates asked invasive questions. Why does your dad look so old? Are you, adopted for real? Some of the bolder children made snide comments about their new home, hinting that they didn't belong in the upscale neighborhood. The twins, already burdened by years of instability, grew quieter, their smiles less frequent. Williams noticed the change and sat them down one evening. People are going to say things, he told them gently, his voice steady but warm. Not because of who you are, but because of who they are. You're here because you belong. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Amara nodded, her chin quivering as she fought back tears. Aaliyah climbed into his lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. We're trying, she whispered. Despite the mounting criticism, Judge Williams refused to back down. He continued his work on the bench, delivering rulings that reflected both the law and his unwavering commitment to justice. At home, he poured his energy into creating a safe, loving environment for the twins. He read them bedtime stories, helped with their homework, and listened when they needed to talk, something they had rarely experienced before. When the media requested interviews, he declined, choosing instead to focus on his role as a father. This isn't about me, he told a close friend. It's about giving those girls the chance they deserve. Over time, the noise began to fade. Some critics moved on to other targets, while others begrudgingly acknowledged that perhaps his decision wasn't as reckless as they had first believed. Meanwhile, supporters began to emerge, community members who applauded his courage, parents who saw in his actions a glimmer of hope for a better world. For Judge Williams, the storm of judgment was a test of his resolve. It reminded him that doing the right thing often came with a cost, but it also reinforced his belief that love and justice were worth fighting for. In the end, it wasn't the critics or the racists who defined his story, it was the bond he had built with Amara and Aaliyah, and the knowledge that, no matter what, they would always have each other. The house was quiet when Judge Williams opened the front door, ushering the twins inside. Their small footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as they cautiously stepped into the unfamiliar space. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the large windows, but the girls remained close to each other, their hands still tightly clasped as if afraid they might be separated again. "Welcome home," Williams said, his voice steady but soft. He gestured toward the living room, where a cozy couch and a shelf full of books waited. The girls didn't respond, their wide eyes scanning the room with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The house was a stark contrast to the foster homes they had known. There were no locks on the cupboards, no plastic bags for their belongings, no rules posted on the walls in block letters. Instead, there were framed photos of landscapes and family heirlooms neatly arranged on the shelves. The scent of fresh laundry lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee from the kitchen. Amara, the more daring of the two, was the first to let go of her sister's hand. She approached the couch cautiously, running her fingers over the soft fabric before glancing back at Aaliyah for reassurance. Her twin stayed by the door, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze fixed on the floor. That evening, Judge Williams prepared dinner, a simple pasta dish with garlic bread. He wasn't much of a cook, but he wanted to give the girls something warm and comforting. As they sat at the dining table, their silence was almost deafening. "Do you like pasta?" he asked, trying to ease the tension. Amara nodded slightly, taking a small bite, but Aaliyah just stared at her plate. Williams noticed her hesitation and didn't push. Instead, he began to tell them about the house, how he had built the bookshelf himself, how the tree outside the window had been there for decades. He hoped his stories might fill the void left by their silence. By the end of the meal, Amara had managed a few whispered comments about how the bread was kind of good. Aaliyah, though still silent, had eaten half her plate, which Williams took as a small victory. When it was time for bed, the girls balked. Williams had set up a shared room for them with twin beds, fresh linens, and a nightlight casting a soft glow across the walls. But as soon as he tried to leave, Aaliyah clung to his arm. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice trembling. Amara, who had already climbed into her bed, looked away, trying to appear braver than she felt. Williams knelt beside Aaliyah, his expression gentle but firm. "I'll be right down the hall," he assured her. "You're safe here. I promise." It took nearly an hour of sitting on the floor, telling them stories about his childhood, before they finally drifted off to sleep. As he closed the door behind him, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had promised them safety, but he knew their fears wouldn't vanish overnight. In the days that followed, Williams began to understand the complexities of fatherhood. He quickly realized that love and care weren't always enough to heal wounds as deep as theirs. Amara, though more outspoken, carried a sharp edge of defiance, testing boundaries as if waiting for him to give up on her. Aaliyah was quieter, her silence often masking the storm of emotions she didn't yet know how to express. Williams faced challenges he hadn't anticipated. The first time Amara threw a tantrum, slamming a door so hard it rattled the windows, he found himself at a loss for how to respond. And when Aaliyah broke into tears over a misplaced stuffed animal, he realized just how fragile their sense of security still was. He made mistakes. He raised his voice once, immediately regretting it when Aaliyah flinched. He burned dinner another night, watching in dismay as Amara muttered, "It's fine," and ate in stony silence. But he also learned, slowly, patiently, what they needed. A gentle touch, a steady presence, and the unwavering reassurance that he wasn't going anywhere. There were glimmers of hope amidst the challenges. The first time Amara laughed, really laughed, was when Williams attempted to braid her hair and ended up with a tangled mess. "You're terrible at this," she giggled, handing him a YouTube tutorial. Aaliyah began to follow him around the house, watching silently as he worked, her small frame a constant shadow. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching an old animated movie, Aaliyah leaned her head against his arm. It was a small gesture, but it filled Williams with an overwhelming sense of purpose. These moments, however fleeting, reminded him why he had made this decision. The road ahead was long, and Williams knew there would be setbacks. The girls were still learning to trust, and he was still learning how to be the father they needed. But each day brought them closer to something they had never had before, a home. As he tucked them in one night, Amara asked, "Are we really staying here? Like, forever?" Williams knelt beside her bed, meeting her gaze with unwavering certainty. "Yes," he said. "This is your home now. For as long as you want it to be." For the first time, Amara smiled, a real, unguarded smile. Aaliyah, already half asleep, mumbled, "Good night, Dad," the words slipping out so naturally that it made Williams pause. As he turned off the light and closed the door, he felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. They weren't just a judge and two wards of the state anymore. They were becoming a family. And in that quiet moment, he knew they were all taking their first steps toward healing, together. Judge Williams sat in his chambers late into the evening, a stack of case files spread across his desk. The faint glow of the desk lamp illuminated his face, etched with determination and the weight of the decision that had been growing inside him since the day he brought Amara and Aaliyah home. It wasn't enough to give them a safe haven, he realized. The system that had failed them, failed so many others, needed to be held accountable. The courtroom had always been his domain, a place where he upheld the law with integrity and fairness. But now, it had become something more, a battleground for justice. The foster care system, riddled with bureaucracy and indifference, wasn't just broken, it was complicit in perpetuating cycles of neglect and inequality. Williams knew this from experience, but seeing its failures reflected in the lives of Amara and Aaliyah had turned his knowledge into resolve. He began to scrutinize every case that crossed his desk, searching for patterns of systemic failure. He noticed how Black children were disproportionately represented in the foster system, shuffled between homes without consideration for their cultural or emotional needs. He saw how resources were allocated unevenly, favoring certain demographics while leaving others to fend for themselves. And he saw the heartbreaking frequency with which children were labeled as problematic rather than being given the support they needed to thrive. It started with small steps. During hearings, he began asking pointed questions, questions that made lawyers squirm and social workers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Why was this child moved 3 times in 6 months, he would ask. What measures were taken to ensure this placement was appropriate? His tone was calm but firm, and his gaze left no room for evasive answers. Word spread quickly among his colleagues. Williams is on a crusade, one muttered in the courthouse cafeteria. Others dismissed his efforts as grandstanding, but some began to take notice. Quietly, a few judges and attorneys reached out, sharing their own frustrations with the system and offering their support. Not everyone welcomed his push for change. Some social service agencies bristled at his demands for accountability, accusing him of overstepping his role. One director even confronted him during a meeting, saying, "Your job is to interpret the law, Judge Williams, not to dismantle the system." "My job," Williams replied evenly, "is to ensure justice. And if the system prevents that, then it's the system that needs to change." The backlash intensified. Anonymous letters criticizing his activist agenda began appearing in his mailbox. At professional events, he was met with polite smiles that quickly faded when he walked away. Even some of his colleagues, those who had once respected him, distanced themselves. But Williams was undeterred. "Let them criticize," he told a friend over coffee one evening. "If they're uncomfortable, it means I'm doing something right." Williams knew he couldn't fight the system alone. He began reaching out to advocates and organizations dedicated to child welfare reform. He attended community meetings where he listened to the stories of parents, foster children, and caseworkers who had been trapped in the system's web of inefficiency and neglect. One evening, he met a former foster youth named Marcus, now an attorney specializing in family law. Marcus's story was strikingly similar to Amara and Aaliyah's: years of instability, racial prejudice, and a lack of support. "I survived," Marcus told him, "but so many others don't. The system isn't designed to help kids like us. It's designed to manage us." Williams saw in Marcus a powerful ally and invited him to collaborate on a project aimed at reforming foster care practices. Together, they began drafting proposals for policy changes, focusing on increasing accountability, providing cultural sensitivity training for foster families, and prioritizing permanency for children. It wasn't long before Williams's efforts gained media attention. Local reporters began covering his rulings, highlighting his tough questions and his refusal to accept the status quo. "Judge Williams challenges foster care system," read one headline. Another labeled him the advocate in robes. With the spotlight came both praise and criticism. Some hailed him as a champion for vulnerable children, while others accused him of politicizing the judiciary. But Williams stayed focused on his mission. He began speaking at conferences, using his platform to call out systemic failures and demand better for the children who depended on the system for survival. At home, Amara and Aaliyah watched their father's crusade with growing pride. Though they didn't fully understand the intricacies of his work, they saw how deeply he cared, not just for them, but for every child who had been failed by the system. One evening, as Williams was reviewing notes for an upcoming speech, Amara approached him hesitantly. Do you think we can help?" she asked, her voice quiet but hopeful. Williams smiled, pulling her into a hug. "You already are," he said. "Every time I see you and your sister thriving, it reminds me why this fight matters." Williams's efforts began to bear fruit. His rulings prompted investigations into negligent foster care practices, leading to reforms in several agencies. Community leaders started rallying around his cause, using his work as a foundation for broader movements aimed at dismantling systemic inequalities. For Williams, the victories were personal. Each step forward was a reminder that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And though the fight was far from over, he knew that every small victory brought him closer to the world he wanted for his daughters, and for every child like them. In the end, it wasn't just about fixing the system. It was about creating a future where children like Amara and Aaliyah didn't have to fight so hard to be seen, heard, and valued. And for Judge Williams, that was a fight worth every sacrifice. The change was subtle at first, like the gentle thaw of winter giving way to spring. Amara and Aaliyah, who had spent the early days in their new home navigating with caution, began to show signs of trust. It was in the way Amara no longer flinched when Williams accidentally raised his voice, or how Aaliyah started humming to herself as she colored at the kitchen table. Small moments, seemingly insignificant, but they were the beginnings of something profound. One evening, as Williams was sorting through papers in his study, he heard laughter from the living room. It was light, unrestrained, and undeniably joyful, a sound he hadn't heard in the house before. He walked in to find the girls sitting on the couch, flipping through a book of silly drawings they'd made together. "What's so funny?" he asked, leaning on the doorframe. Amara looked up, grinning. "You wouldn't get it," she teased, but there was no malice in her voice, only warmth. Aaliyah giggled, her shy smile lighting up her face. For the first time, the house felt alive, filled with the kind of energy he had only dreamed of since bringing them home. As the girls grew more comfortable, they began to share pieces of their past, stories that were heartbreaking but laced with resilience. Amara spoke of the times she shielded Aaliyah from cruel foster siblings, standing between her sister and the world with a fierce protectiveness that belied her small frame. Aaliyah, in turn, shared how she would secretly collect little treasures, a button, a smooth pebble, a piece of ribbon, to give to Amara as tokens of comfort. Their bond, forged in the crucible of hardship, was unshakable. Williams listened, his heart aching with both sorrow and admiration. These girls, who had endured so much, carried themselves with a strength that inspired him. It was a strength he recognized, a reflection of his own mother, who had fought tirelessly to protect and nurture him against the odds. The girls' resilience began to change Williams in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had spent years immersing himself in his work, using the courtroom as a shield against his own pain and regrets. But now, watching Amara and Aaliyah navigate their healing with courage and grace, he felt a shift within himself. One night, as they sat together after dinner, Amara asked, "Dad, do you ever get scared?" The question caught him off guard. He set down his glass of water, considering his answer. "I do," he admitted, his voice steady but soft. "I've been scared many times in my life. But I've learned that being scared doesn't mean you stop trying." Amara nodded thoughtfully, her eyes fixed on him. Aaliyah, sitting quietly beside her, reached out to squeeze his hand. "We get scared too," she said in a small voice. "But it's not so bad when we're together." The simplicity of her words struck him deeply. It wasn't just a lesson for the girls, it was a lesson for him. In their unity, in their unwavering support for each other, they had found a way to move forward. And now, they were teaching him to do the same. As the months passed, the house transformed into a home. The walls, once bare and impersonal, were now decorated with framed photos and the girls' artwork. The dining table, which had once seated only Williams, was now a place of shared meals and laughter. Even the quiet moments, like reading bedtime stories or helping with homework, became imbued with a sense of belonging. Williams found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before. He shared stories from his own childhood, tales of triumphs and struggles that mirrored the girls' experiences. He admitted his fears and vulnerabilities, showing them that even adults were still learning, still healing. In return, the girls blossomed. Amara's defiance softened into confidence, her sharp edges giving way to a bold determination that inspired everyone around her. Aaliyah, once shy and reserved, began to speak her mind, her quiet strength emerging as a steady, grounding presence. One Saturday afternoon, as they worked together in the garden planting flowers, Williams looked at the girls and realized how much they had changed him. They had taught him to slow down, to savor the small joys he had overlooked in his years of relentless focus on work. They had shown him the power of forgiveness, not just for others, but for himself. Most importantly, they had reminded him of the simple, profound beauty of love, unconditional and enduring. "We make a good team," Amara said, wiping dirt from her hands as she admired their work. "We do," Williams agreed, his smile genuine. He looked at Aaliyah, who was carefully watering the newly planted flowers. "And we're just getting started." The road wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt and fear, moments when the scars of their past threatened to resurface. But together, they faced those challenges head-on, leaning on each other for strength. They were a family now, messy, imperfect, but deeply connected. For Williams, the girls had become more than his daughters. They were his teachers, his inspiration, his second chance at a life filled with purpose and love. And for Amara and Aaliyah, Williams was more than a judge or a guardian. He was their father, their protector, and the person who believed in them when no one else had. Together, they found a path to healing, one step at a time. And in doing so, they created something extraordinary, a bond that would carry them forward, no matter what the future held. The story of Judge Williams and the twin girls, Amara and Aaliyah, began as a quiet ripple in their small community. At first, it was just another case in the foster care system, another set of statistics about children lost in bureaucracy. But as the details emerged, a judge stepping beyond the bench to adopt 2 children, his battle against systemic injustice, and the unbreakable bond that formed between them, it became something much more. It became a symbol of hope. The local news was the first to cover the story, publishing a heartfelt article titled "Judge Turns Father, a Bold Act of Justice and Love." The piece detailed Williams's journey, the resilience of the twins, and the challenges they overcame together. The article quickly went viral, shared by people across the country who saw in it a glimmer of something rare, a genuine act of humanity. Within days, national media picked up the story. Williams reluctantly agreed to an interview, sitting beside Amara and Aaliyah as they shared their experiences. "I didn't do this to be a hero," he said during the interview. "I did it because no child should feel like they're invisible. And because these girls reminded me of something we all need to remember: love and justice are not separate." The girls, now more confident, spoke about their father with warmth and pride. Amara, her voice steady, said, "He gave us a home when no one else would. But more than that, he gave us a chance to believe in ourselves again." Aaliyah added softly, "He showed us that family doesn't have to come from blood. It comes from the heart." The story resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. Letters began pouring in, some from former foster children who found hope in the judge's actions, others from parents inspired to adopt or advocate for systemic change. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #JusticeAndLove and #EveryChildMatters, turning their story into a rallying cry for reform. Activists and policymakers took notice. Williams was invited to speak at conferences and panels, where he shared not only his personal journey but also his vision for a foster care system that prioritized children's emotional and cultural needs. "This isn't just about my daughters," he said during one speech. "It's about every child who has ever been overlooked, dismissed, or treated as a problem to be managed. We can do better. We must do better." As awareness grew, so did the impact of their story. Community programs were launched to support foster children, offering mentorship, counseling, and resources to help them navigate the challenges of the system. Schools began implementing training programs for teachers to better understand and address the trauma that many foster children carry. Even lawmakers introduced bills aimed at reforming the foster care process, citing Williams's advocacy as a catalyst for change. For the judge and his daughters, the attention was both overwhelming and humbling. Williams often reminded himself and the girls that their story was just one among many. "We've been given a platform," he told them one evening, "and it's our responsibility to use it for those who don't yet have a voice." The public spotlight also became a source of healing for Amara and Aaliyah. For years, they had carried the weight of feeling unseen, their pain hidden behind the walls of a system that didn't value them. Now, their story was helping others, and that realization gave them a sense of purpose. Amara, always the bold one, began speaking at youth events, sharing her journey to inspire other foster children. "You're not alone," she would tell them. "Your story matters, and so do you." Aaliyah, quieter but equally passionate, found her voice through art, creating powerful pieces that reflected her experiences and the strength she found in her family. At home, life settled into a rhythm of normalcy. There were still challenges, moments of doubt, flashes of old fears, but they faced them together. Williams continued his work as a judge, but his approach was forever changed. Each case was a reminder of the lives behind the files, the humanity often lost in legal jargon. On the anniversary of their adoption, the three of them gathered around the dining table for a quiet celebration. Amara and Aaliyah presented him with a hand-painted plaque that read, "Home is where love grows." Williams, overcome with emotion, pulled them into a hug, realizing once again how far they had all come. Their journey became a story told not just in courtrooms and conferences, but in homes and classrooms, inspiring people to act with courage and compassion. It showed that even in the face of systemic failure, individuals could make a difference. And it reminded everyone that healing wasn't just about fixing broken systems, it was about building bonds strong enough to endure. What do you think about this story of love, resilience, and justice? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and remind us of the power of the human spirit.